So that brings us to the last game this week, and it's Michigan-Ohio State, which is a huge game every year. We would argue it's a huge game because they're the only two teams in the Big Ten that are worth a crap, although Wisconsin might have a little bit of an argument.
And see, every Big Ten fan that listens to our show to listen to that game just shut off.
Yeah,
So that's your
both
fault.
of them just got mad, and they'll both comment. But it's hard to argue otherwise at this point. Maybe Nebraska has an outside argument of being decent, but you've got Michigan, Ohio State, Wisconsin is all right. They're really bad on offense, really good on defense, and then maybe Nebraska. But Michigan, in my opinion, I think you and I are going to disagree on this game a little bit in terms of who's going to come out the winner. But Michigan, in my opinion, should be a little concerned offensively, and I'll give you a number to back that up. They beat Indiana 20-10 this weekend, and I know O'Korn's playing for the first time under this offense, kind of thrown into the fire, but he's got a lot of experience. So anyway, Michigan scored 20 points in this game against Indiana. Indiana has given up 20 or fewer only two other times this year, and those teams were FIU and Ball State. So I think that's kind of a red flag if you're looking at, how this Michigan offense, regardless of whose quarterback, is going to match up against a really good Ohio State defense. Both of these teams do play really good defense, but you saw O'Korn was 7 for 16, 3.7 per. They managed 4.5 per carry on the ground against Indiana, but this is 2 weeks in a row where Michigan's really struggled offensively, and then you can flip the page and say, well, Ohio State 17-16 over Michigan State, and we're really left with not knowing much at all about the Big Ten at this point. And is that fair to say, even in teams with really clean records like Michigan and Ohio State, that we still don't know much about them?
I think it's perfectly fair to say. I think we should start off by sort of pointing out the lopsided nature of the Big Ten. Would you agree with that? The weird dichotomy. This is something we've been tracking and talking about internally for a while. You want me to go into that right now and sort
Yeah,
of
I think it's a
break
fair
down how that
point.
works?
We talked about it a little bit last week, and I think it still holds true. And I think the Pac-12 has a good bit of it as well. And I don't know what to think about the Big 12 because they really may not have a good team in that conference. And we're not being homers, y'all. The numbers back us up. But yeah, go into that for a little bit. I know you got a little taste of the Big Ten rant last week, and I think it felt so good that you're ready for another. So have at it.
Right. I started sort of trying to track last week, going into the week, where all the top ranked teams were, and the two of us had a discussion offline about, you know, where are all the ranked teams relative to each other? What really were all the non-conference games? Just trying to peg them all down. We're having a really hard time finding where anybody's really done a decent job of just laying out all the non-conference games this season. The truth is, there aren't very many that are worth a flip, and that's what you end up with. But you kind of have to run down the slate to figure it out. But in trying to figure all this information out, what we discovered was the Big Ten is absolutely a set of haves and a set of have-nots. And you've heard me talk in the past, or some of you have, that the 8 of you that listen to our show, about this concept of a bag of wins. But the long and short of it is, if you've got 14 teams in the conference and you all play 8 games, that's 114 wins or 112 wins, I should say, they get spread out among all the teams. So that's 112 conference wins. You're guaranteed 112 wins to be given to all the teams in your conference. The question is, how do they get distributed? Do they get distributed evenly? Do they get distributed, some getting all of them, some getting few? And let me point out that it doesn't matter how good on average your conference is. You're going to have 112 wins no matter if you're terrible or if you're fantastic. So all those wins internally, it just matters whether or not you have parity within your conference, meaning whether everybody's more or less equal. This year, I am hard pressed to ever think of an example of a conference that was more delineated in terms of teams that were good and teams that are not. I say that because there are 5 teams, currently in the Big Ten that are ranked or have been flirting with ranked. That's Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nebraska. Everybody sort of knows those. There are also 9 other teams, right, that are not, and it's the best of those are Indiana, Maryland, and Iowa, and Minnesota. I almost left them out, but they're probably the next on the list. But the 5 teams, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, Nebraska, Wisconsin, have lost a combined 1 game to the other 9. That was the big upset of Iowa over Michigan in that weird game. Otherwise, those 5 teams, when playing the other 9, and that's, oh gosh, it's about 35 games. They're like 34-1. And I say that all to say that it's not that they win these games or that they have really great conference records necessarily because they're so good or so bad. They're just so much clearly better than the others. And if you've been watching scores from Rutgers and Michigan State and Maryland and Indiana, you know that those teams aren't overly good. And it's not, there's no evidence that the other lower tier teams are any good, right? I mean, those 9, again, there's a group of 5 and a group of 9. No team in the group of 9 has won a ranked game. A ranked game out of conference. The only ranked win for those 9 teams, these are 9 Power 5 teams in the Big Ten, is Iowa over Michigan. So, and they've played, when they have played in non-conference games, they do have a number of losses. So, when you break it down, what you end up with is a situation where 5 teams are basically winning by default because, frankly, there's no reason to believe the rest of the conference is any good. And those 5 teams have to split up. When they play each other, they have to split up the wins some way. So even if you rolled a dice and you said, if I've got 5 teams and I'm going to roll a dice to see who wins, you're pretty much guaranteed with only 5 that somebody is going to go undefeated in dice rolls. So it's just pure odds. In this case, if you throw out the other 9, if you just look at the 5-team, the 5-team splits, Penn State is 1-1 in that set of 5. Ohio State is 1-1 in the set of 5. Michigan is 2-0. Wisconsin is 1-2, and Nebraska is 0-2. And to get further there, the Big Ten West, their only win to date is the fact that Wisconsin beat Nebraska. The Big Ten West did not ever beat Michigan, Ohio State, or Penn State. So the Big Ten West, really, you have 2 teams that beat the rest of the Big Ten West, which does not have any ranked wins other than, well, I guess Iowa did beat Michigan. And other than that, Wisconsin in the opener beat LSU by 2. That's it. And I know I've talked a lot here, but what we're getting to is the entire Big Ten as a whole is really dependent on Ohio State thumping Oklahoma, which is probably meaningful, and Wisconsin beating LSU in the opener by 2 in a game where LSU actually was probably the statistically better team. I'm not saying LSU is necessarily that great, but LSU may well end up being 4th in their division in the SEC. So that's it. That's the only base of comparison for the entire Big Ten. And that's what we're hanging all our hats on, is the fact that you have 5 teams that are better than the rest. Those 5 teams naturally have to share losses between each other, and they share their wins. They're going to collect all the wins. And basically what they're doing is they're all splitting the games. They're all going 1-1, 1-1, 1-2. And so you end up 10-1 because they beat, the 8 or 9 teams in the conference that suck. They lose to one of the 2 good teams they play. We talk about how they, Penn State has a great win over Ohio State, and Ohio State Ohio State has a great win over Wisconsin, and Michigan has a great ranked win over Wisconsin. Nebraska didn't beat any of the group of 5, by the way. The only teams they've beaten are the other 9 teams that can't beat anybody. So I'm not really sure why Nebraska deserves any respect, frankly, from that perspective. I know that's harsh, but it's just the way it is. And so that that's the bag of wins concept. It's right now in the Big Ten, there is a clear delineation between the five halves and the nine have-nots, and because there is such a delineation, every Big Ten team basically gets 6 free wins. They have their 2 cupcakes, so that gets them to 8. Um, and then all they have to do is, in those other 2 games, go 1-1, and they're, a 9 or 10 win team, and that's then they end up ranked. But it's impossible to say how good they would be against a more consistently hard schedule. But there's no doubt you can talk about how good those teams are, and I think they pass the eye test, and I buy that completely. But Texas A&M loses to Mississippi State. There's a lot of A&M LSU caliber teams is the argument, but there is no Mississippi State in the Big Ten. They don't have those teams to trip up against, and it makes it really hard to judge. I know that's a long rant, but I think it's worth discussing. And I think it really is important to view the Big Ten as 5 teams that matter and 9 teams that might as well be the Mountain West Conference.
And the thing that's interesting about this is the same thing could be said about the Big 12 and the Pac 12. But I think to a lesser team quality extent, we have a Washington team who is sitting on the edge of the playoffs, whose only win to hang their hat on is Utah, right? I mean, their out of conference was Portland State, was Rutgers, one of those teams, and Idaho. So I think it's crazy how we get really down on these teams when they suck out of conference. Cough, Oklahoma, cough. They had a terrible season out of conference. USC gets blown out by Alabama 52-6, falls all the way out of the top 25. So when they play out of conference, we take them for who they are out of conference, and then we dump them in the rankings accordingly. And then when they close ranks and play a bunch of teams in conference who we have no relative strength or ability to gauge on, and they win a bunch of games, they shoot back up the rankings. And I don't, like you said last week, there is no answer to this question, because we saw in 2014 Ohio State had a garbage schedule outside of Michigan State. They had one ranked win all year, Michigan State. Like, that's it. They opened with November 8th was their first ranked game. November 8th for a national champion. And so they were good in the playoffs. They were real good. They beat Alabama. But we didn't know how good they were until they got there, because they didn't play anybody. They played a bunch of, 5-7 type teams on the way to a playoff berth. But because they are christened number 2, number 3 to start the season, as long as they beat those teams, they're in. So, and that's not we're kind of picking on the Big Ten here, but it could be applied to other teams. And it's really more than anything, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's more than anything, it's a plea to have these teams play more big time out of conference games. More than anything else, is we can know how good these internal relative strength games are when you're playing other teams in your conference, when we have more data points out of conference against other big name teams. Is that fair to say?
It is. The example I give, this is my analogy, and I used it at the very start of the year, and I'm going to bring it up again because this is the perfect example of it. It's like you have a picture of the Andes and a picture of the Himalayas, and somebody asks you which mountain is taller. You don't have any base of comparison. You just see a mountain and a mountain, and maybe Everest isn't necessarily that much taller than the mountains around it, honestly. And then you have, maybe you have a, Mount St. Helens or something that dominates this landscape. You might be tempted to think, well, Mount St. Helens is taller because look how much it dominates the mountains around it. But because you don't know where the mountains start and you don't know how they all relate to each other, you can't compare those two photographs. And that's the problem we have. We see peaks. In 2014, Ohio State dominated the Big Ten. The problem was we knew the rest of the Big Ten was not very good, and they weren't. It was a matter of, like, when you looked at Ohio State, okay, they're 40 points better than a team that is, going to lose by 10 to anybody in the SEC. Well, the everybody, if let's say they're 40 points better than Arkansas, we'll say that for point of comparison. And we know Alabama beat Arkansas by 30. What does that mean about Arkansas versus Ohio State? It was that kind of weird, bizarre set of comparisons. We don't have any way to directly relate them, and in this case, we really know very little between the two. And I'm going to tack one thing on before we stop this rant. Well, I'll make two more points. The first is in this bag of wins concept. An important thing to realize is the effect that moving to 14 teams had on this, because Rutgers, who was in Maryland, who were added to the conference, are a combined 2-14. And what that means is for every team in they generated 14 wins in the Big 12, in the Big 10, and only gave 2 losses away. So every team in the Big 10, basically that was there before Maryland and Rutgers showed up, they got everybody, especially in the Big 10 East, all got an extra 2 wins on their schedule that maybe they would have had to play. Maybe instead of playing Nebraska or Wisconsin, now they're playing Maryland and Rutgers. And so that even lets the top tier teams, it pushes them up that much higher because it's an extra gimme win that they're playing a quote unquote Power 5 opponent that really isn't very good, that normally they'd be bolstered a little more. Even if it was interconference play, they would have to play Minnesota, who may not be that great, but at least they're 7-4 overall, rather than a Rutgers team who's 0-8 in conference play, 2-9 overall. Rutgers has only scored 73 points in conference play. They're averaging less than 10 points a game, and they are giving up about 40, averaging. Their average loss, I think, is 40-9. That's the math in conference play right now. In the second thing I'll say by extension, when I talk about that in the group of 9, and somebody may think I'm being unrealistic, currently in the Big 10, 7 of the 14 teams have a overall losing record. 7 of 14. And it's hard to say exactly, what it's going to pan out to be, but it is entirely possible that we see, 7 Big 10 teams with losing records to end the season. It's unlikely because there's several at 5 and 6 that play teams that are worse, but it's actually possible for there to be only 7 bowl eligible teams in the Big 10. So when you look at Michigan and Ohio State and Penn State, I think it's extremely important to realize it's not only, you say, well, there's all these teams, right? Well, they all, at most, they played 3, but most all these teams of the group of 5, they only played 2 others. So, and I know I'm bordering on a long rant, and I'm going to cut it off here.
Bordering.
But Michigan, for example, there's 4 others: Ohio State, Penn State, Nebraska, Wisconsin. They only played 2 of the 4. They will, and that's the way it is for everybody because there's so many of these crappy teams. They replace the other good ones. They barely have to play the other good teams in the conference. So it's really watered down not just the non-conference opponents, but it's watered down the opponents they have inside their own conference. And that's made it even that much harder to tell who's good and who's bad. Okay, I'll shut up now. There you go.
All right, so we got to talk a little bit about the actual game now that we've killed the Big Ten for 30 minutes. I think for me, I like Ohio State at quarterback a little more than Michigan, even though Barrett's had his struggles this year. I just feel like in that offense, he's going to be a little more successful. What I'm really interested to see is which one of these teams is poised to do anything against a good defense, because we've seen both of them struggle with Wisconsin, who's a good defense, but we've also seen them struggle with average defenses. So to your point about how there's so much garbage in the rest of the conference where they can run it up, and we've seen that Ohio State and Michigan are really good at running it up on teams that they have a decided advantage on. Who in this game has the advantage against a good defense?
I think that's a fair question. Before the injury to Spate, I would have probably said Michigan because I honestly feel like they have a more traditional pro-style passing game. And a pro-style passing game, there's a reason it's called pro style. It is designed to generate yardage against a very good defense. It schematically creates open guys so you can have a play despite the fact that the defenders are very, very good. Spread offenses, and the reason they exist in college is they exploit weaknesses in the defense. So a pro style basically makes your offense good, and a spread exploits where the other team's bad. In college, it's extremely rare for a defense to really be that good in college. So spread offenses tend to dominate because they're almost always effective. You add in the RPO stuff, and that's a whole other level, but you can have RPO elements in what is actually still a fairly pro style offense. But Ohio State is very much a run spread. We've seen all season that JT Barrett is not a very good downfield thrower. I mean, he's accurate and effective in the short range game at times, but once he starts getting intermediate long range, he's just not a very accurate, consistent passer. Michigan can, they're not great at throwing it around the field vertically, but they can do it. And that tells me that I personally think Michigan is a little better equipped stylistically. The issue is like the injury at quarterback, but even still, I'm going to give a narrow edge to Michigan personally.
Which says a lot about what you think about Ohio State's offense if they do manage to win this game and get into a playoff scenario against a team that's good on both sides of the ball. Because if everybody needs to think about that. We're talking about a Michigan team who lost to Iowa with their quarterback, a Michigan team that only managed 20 without their quarterback against Ohio State. You still think Michigan has an advantage offensively over Ohio State, which doesn't look good for Ohio State in the playoffs. So before we get into predicting the score, I'd love for you, because you followed Ohio State in 2014 pretty heavily, and I think your computer model predicted them to beat Alabama in the playoffs.
It did.
Does that 2014 Ohio State team, how do they compare to the 2016 version?
I think the 2014 Ohio State team is probably 20 to 30 points better than the 2016 team.
Wow.
They are that 2014 Ohio State team was freaking special. And as we said, we didn't really know because they had a bad game against Virginia Tech, but they were just utterly dominant the entire season to such an extent that I had to put a huge disclaimer in the model that said, I don't know how well accurate this is because I don't know what a bad game for Ohio State looks like. And, it turns out that they were really good. And the thing that team had, I honestly am very curious if they would not have lost had JT Barrett been the quarterback. I think they got Cardale Jones, who gave them a vertical passing game ability that offsets some of these issues when they play good run defenses at the perfect time when the championship game and against Alabama. Because even though I think in a game to game sense, JT Barrett is more consistent and more productive, Cardale Jones creates a little more verticality that creates more balance, that you actually, as odd as it is, you want JT Barrett. And I talk a lot about the differences, right? And volatility and whatnot. You want JT Barrett, the consistent guy, against your below average opponents every week because you're going to win by 3 scores. But you want Cardale Jones, who's the more high ceiling, volatile guy when you're playing Alabama, because the consistent production from JT Barrett may not be at a high enough level to really sell it. But yeah, I mean, well, and we're seeing in the NFL, right, just how freaking good Zeke Elliott really was. No, that 2014 Ohio State team was significantly better than this year's, in my opinion.
Okay, so let's finish this one up with a score prediction. I'm gonna say Ohio State 19, Michigan 13. But give me your score, and we'll close with that.
Okay. Yeah, it is a close game, and I think it could go either way. But like you, I think it's going to be a little low scoring. But I think it's going to be more like Michigan 24, Ohio State 20. I think they both find a way to score points in this ball game. But I just don't think Ohio State's going to be productive enough to win it. I don't know. It's a toss up, but that's the way I'm leaning right now.
So, that's our show for this week, y'all. This was probably, I think, our longest set of shows. We had a lot of ranting to do. But I think it's funny because that's where sort of the more interesting talking points, especially for what we see in the data, come out of it. So if you didn't get a chance, check out our review shows from the games that we covered in week 12. They're going to be out there as well. But again, thanks so much, podcast listeners, YouTube watchers. We really appreciate you coming back every week. For this week, Iron Bowl watchers, give us your score predictions. If you are a Michigan or Ohio State fan, we'd love for your feedback as well on this particular video. So comment below, but make sure if you give us a comment that you back it up with some data, because that's what we love to engage with people. Tell you how you're wrong, have you tell us how we're wrong, but we're a data-focused show, and if this is your first time listening to us, you may have heard some stuff that's a little nerdier than you're used to, so bring it, both barrels. We're happy to have it. Just give us some data to support your position. So thanks so much, everybody. God bless. Have a great week.